Hi, welcome to Talking Books and Stuff, the program that talks all about books and writing and stuff. Here's your host, Dennis Rimmer.
Hello again, it's Dennis Rimmer here for Talking Books and Writing and Stuff. And today we're talking to Dennis Cooley, based in Manitoba. Sir, how are things in Manitoba looking these days as we head into spring and summer season?
Well, it was really cold in Winnipeg. I say it was because that's a matter of time, but also I'm talking to you from Saskatoon right now, so I've been away a few days. But it's been a cold March in April.
It has been.
Yeah.
Yep. Same here. We're just down the road. We're in Radisson, Saskatchewan, so we're practically neighbors. But we're recording this near the end of April. It will be up, as you know, dear listener, by the end of June, first part of July. Dennis Cooley is with us. He is an award-winning poet and famous for all of the things he's done in Manitoba with the University of Manitoba. But I understand, sir, you got to start near Estevan on the farm. What from the farm led you to being a man of letters? How did you get from A to B?
Well, not so far in some ways, actually. Some of my best writing, I think, comes out of that experience. One of my best poems, actually, was a poem about my father riding a tractor, of all things. I think that came very quickly. I wrote it in about an hour, which is a record for me. I take weeks to do things, but I got it out of a very personal and intimate sense of that memory. So I worked off those memories, that sense of kind of empathy, I guess, with creatures too. I love animals, and I remember those connections very powerfully, and it's continued into some of the things I've written. I wrote a book called The Bestiary, which is a series of animal poems about creatures.
And so going back to your farm days, that was in the good old days, I put it, when a family farm could support a family, and you had your own milk, and you sent the cream off to the co-op creamery and got some money, and you had a cash crop of some sorts, and you fed the herd with the chop from the grain, and had some pigs running around.
And you sold a few eggs.
Yeah.
That's exactly. This was really the very end of those days. We left the farm when I was 15, I guess. And the whole family was sorry to leave. Well, we liked it there, but it was really an economic move that took us off the farm.
And so these days, talking about farming for a minute, it's either like a giant farm or pretty much nothing at all. So that seems to be the way it's going. Sadly to say, but that's the way of life, I guess.
Yeah. Huge fields and farm houses, far and few between. Yeah.
So
it was wiped out. Small farms are wiped.
So you went from home to the University of Saskatchewan. What did you study at the U of S?
I enrolled in the Faculty of Education. I was going to be a high school teacher, but I'd been all my life interested in books and literature. I loved poems, even as a kid, and even through high school, when, so far as I know, none of my friends liked poetry or paid it any attention. But I was going to study English. I was going to be a teacher of English, but in those days, probably it's no different now, you had to have at least one other, what they call, teachable subject. So I chose biology, largely, I suspect, because my sister, who was there, was studying biology, and that seemed to make it a little more plausible or credible. I don't know. Anyway, that was my combination, and as an undergraduate. Then I went into special work in the English department to do a honors degree in English, and then beyond that, an MA in English there. After that, then do a PhD in the University of Rochester in New York.
And so you just decided to keep on going with the academic side rather than become a teacher. Was there any one moment that made you select that path?
Well, yeah, it was kind of two-stage things. It's really funny. I often say that our lives are largely determined by chance. Big decisions or the big moments often aren't premeditated or planned. They just happen, a kind of serendipity. And certainly it was for me in some obvious senses. The year I was doing more work in English because I really liked it and wanted to be better prepared to teach in the high schools in the province, one of my profs said, "We got this program on graduate studies and we might be interested in this." And I said, "I don't know what is that? What does that mean?" So it sounded okay, and I enrolled in this for 1 year. And that year, one of my professors in that program said to me, "Had you thought about a PhD?" And I said, "Well, what would that be?" How would I go about this? So those two consecutive moments took me in that direction. Obviously, I was prepared for it. I loved reading, writing, and thinking about literature. But I didn't make any great distinction between teaching and being a professor. The major part of your work as a prof is teaching, and I like doing that.
And it looks like here, if reading a quick bio, you were employed with the Blakeney government in Saskatchewan for a while.
That's right. Yeah.
You didn't stick with politics. You didn't stick with politics, though, I take it.
Well, I was looking for an academic job. That was what I was hoping for. But what happened when I finished my PhD, there were no academic positions for me, at least. And so I taught for 1 year upgrading in Estevan. And then I worked for 1 year for the Blakeney government. And as I was into the end of the first year, an old prof, a friend of mine, called and said, "I got a position for 1 year appointment if you can come, but it's for a year." I said, "I'm coming." So I came, and luckily for me, that turned into a permanent job.
And you were there ever since. That was at the University of Manitoba, through the University of Manitoba?
That's right.
Yep.
That's right. And a place called St. John's College. They have several colleges there. And that was important. It may seem peripheral if you don't know those institutions. But that was a very friendly and creative site. There was great support among the colleagues in multiple ways in creative work and in scholarly work and community work and part of that college community. So I loved it there, and it was really good for me. And I met some wonderful friends and colleagues there who had a big influence on my academic and literary life.
And speaking of your literary life, when did your first book come out?
1980. 1980.
And that was called, or was it Leaving?
Leaving, that's the one. It's called Leaving. It was a very small little book, but it included a poem, which I believe was called Leaving. I'm trying to remember. Anyway, it was a long poem about my father. And a couple of years later, I took that piece about my dad and combined it with several other sections to do a long poem called Fielding. So that book then that came out a few years later was a long poem about the death of my father.
And just as a note, Fielding is the next town up the road from here. But
yes.
There's nothing there anymore. There's a couple of houses, I think. But
I know.
My wife's family, my wife's family came from Fielding, so her brothers were born in Fielding. So
okay, there it is.
Yeah, there it is.
Coincidence.
Everybody's connected. A lot of those books were published by Turnstone Press. What can you tell us about that?
Well, I was one of the several people who started it in 1975. There's a little confusion in the dates here, but I think that's right. It was 75 or 6. But there were several of us who started this thing in a pub in Winnipeg, where we were graduate students and young professors. We were all excited about Canadian literature, studying it and teaching it. And we thought, look, there's nowhere for writers in Manitoba, poets in Manitoba specifically at the time, to go anywhere with their material. So let's start a press. So we did start it, and there it is still blazing away. The people who started have all long gone, including myself. But yeah, we started it, and it's carried on with, I think, some importance for the literary community there and more widely.
And
so, yeah.
Speaking of your influences as a poet, who would you name as your top influences or influencers, I guess, as they say these days?
Yeah, I always find it hard to do the estimate in anything, and especially if it's a single one. What's your favorite writer? I cannot say that.
Right.
I know you're not asking that question, but I just find it very hard to do these superlative ones as in the top of the list. But I can certainly tell you that Robert Crouch has been a big influence as a writer, but also as the way he championed writing and Canadian literature and talked about it. He had an enormous influence on me, but on many, many, many people. But lots of other people were influential for me. Robert Duncan, the American poet, Douglas Barber, who died only a couple of years ago, was one of many influences. Michael Ondaatje, kind of this goes on and on, really.
And that led you to your own poems, of course. So can you describe a poem? Like, what is a poem?
A very good question. And the answer I give you is not very satisfactory for me, and probably even less so for anyone else. But for me, a poem is a relatively brief act of language that is designed not primarily to provide information, but to open a kind of experience excitement in language. So a fairly brief and often intense experience in language.
And how do you go about writing a poem? Do you write a poem in one go, or is it you put something down and then go away and come back to it later, and then maybe years later you finish it? How does it work for you?
Yeah, well, I was just talking about the poem I wrote for my dad at one time. That was part of a longer poem. The night my mother died, I sat down, and within about an hour, I had written a poem, which is a two-part poem. First about my mother, and then about my father, and I then separated them out later into separate poems. But I wrote that in one quick fell swoop, and I changed almost nothing in it. That's just about the only poem in my life, I think, in which I did that. Most of the time, I work on them for weeks and months and years even. Right now, on my desk, are two big stacks of poems for two books that I'm supposed to be providing soon to publishers. And I've been working on them since at least 1989. And I've gone through hundreds and hundreds of pages, not a word of a lie. I've gone hundreds and hundreds of pages of these things, revising them and discarding them and writing new stuff and moving them here. Basically the answer is I work for a long time on things, usually over revision. Often I can write stuff pretty fast, but to get to the point where I'm ready to send them on, it often takes weeks, at least weeks, and generally many, many months to do that.
Now, do you write pen and paper or computer, typewriter? How do you do it?
Depends on what I'm writing. I do correspondence on the computer. I do essays and statements on computer, but I generally draft poems by hand. But what's become increasingly the case for me, though, is that I do notes by hand and beginnings of poems, and I type that into the computer. So I got clean copy.
Right.
I print that, and then I work on it. I get out my pencil and pen, and I write on it and stroke things out and suggest options, other alternatives, and talk to myself there. And then I'll throw it back in the computer again. And I'll often go through those kind of stages many, many times. So it's generally the way I work on those things.
And why do you write? What's in it for you? What do you get out of it?
Satisfaction and pleasure. This seems unseemly when it's supposed to be painful and some matter of anguish and self-harm, but I love doing it. It's also maybe a compulsion is too strong a word, but you feel kind of I need to do this. It would be good for me to do this. So I suppose if you hear that sort of language, you might suppose this is perhaps therapeutic, and I think it probably is. But a lot of writers talk about how painful it is to write.
Yes.
And how much they fear the page. But for me, this is fun. I got a chance to get in here. I think of writing as play. It's an adventure. Doesn't mean that what you're writing is of no consequence to anybody, or that you write out of disregard to the world or other people or whatever. Not at all. But you want to get in there and write because you want to do the best you can with the language to do things that excite or move or offend or please you in one way or another. So it's an active passion.
And that leads us to Dennis Cooley and Body Works, the work I have in my hands right now. It's from the University of Calgary Press. So was there a goal, an aim in putting together this collection?
Well, I always had enormous sympathies for the material world. And I'm using the word here as I'm sure you'll realize, not as it's used pejoratively, as in people who are selfish or self-centered or whatever, but a matter of regard for the given world that's there's made of atoms and various forces in the cosmos out of which we've all come and everything has derived. But especially interested in the interrelatedness of life. I've always been that way. I talked about the sympathy with animals, the love for animals, creatures. I have a strong sense of fellow creaturedness, that we're creatures among creatures. And I would argue that this is, in its own way, a kind of ecological vision, that we're interconnected, and we need to recognize and honor that, and to if you will, to honor the material world. And I mean this now, and it can be even disembodied, that this is a world, this is the world we got, and we better love it and look after it.
Now, was this book put together from start to finish, or was it a work that was scattered throughout the years and then you put them together later?
Good question. Combinations, they often are for me. One section I did write fairly quickly and recently, in getting this book together. Some parts go way back. I rewrote two pieces that are at least 30 years old. And that's part of my constant revising too. I always rewrite things. And in this case, I'm pretty sure I've improved them. But they also brought them in because they just aren't available to anybody very easily. One probably would be almost impossible for most people to find or even know it existed. But so there's some very old pieces. And then over stretches, there were things. There were two big events in my life that led to, I think, focusing on this as a possibility. Years ago, I had been stricken as an appendix blew out, and I was in hospital for weeks with that. So I wrote a book basically out of that, Troubled Body. Much earlier than that, I'd written a poem called Soul Searching, in which I expressed real sympathy for the bodies and much less for the soul, seeing the soul as often as imperial and rigid and inappreciative of the material world. But in this book, then, I was able to pick up the damaged body, not now the body which lost an appendix, but a body who fell and broke his hip and came down with arthritis. So that became part of an interest in skeleton and bones and joints, right? So I wrote a bunch of disjointed poems, I was calling them provisionally. but also then I had a heart replacement, a valve replacement on my heart. So I wrote some heart poems. Those were even more recent.
Right.
So two of the major sections were what began out of those personal medical experiences.
And I've got in my hands the book, A Body Works, and just by chance I opened it up to Penny Wise. And so that it's just scanning it quickly here. It's really a fun piece of work, I think. It's
good.
Yeah, the man they hung, according to the papers, the Peters and the Poppers, folded like an accordion when he held up the bank in Plum Cooley, and the manager closed around the hole in his belief. It was spring, he was sprung, the earth flung loose from penury and on. So it's just excellent use of words, obviously. You're the professor. And then I'm wondering about, it ends like Billy Budd, like a Union Jack. Now, to my recollection, Billy Budd was a sailor who was hung for treason or something, or mutiny years ago. So how does that fit in with Pennywise?
He was. The poem that you have just been reading from, and thanks for the reading, by the way. You wouldn't want to go on tour with me, would you?
Oh, sure.
you come as a reader. The poem that you're reading from, I'm not remembering the title of it, but it is a fallout or remnant, a set-aside poem from a long poem many, many years ago called Bloody Jack. The main character, Jack Kravchenko, was held up a bank in Plum Cooley in Manitoba.
Oh, yes.
And in the process of the holdup, he ended up killing the bank manager, and he ended up being hung for that murder. So this poem derives from that original work. I've rewritten it, a bit with that in mind. But anyway, your connection with the hanging of Billy Budd and the hanging of Jack Kravchenko are there for me. Certainly wouldn't be evident to almost any reader who wouldn't have known about the Kravchenko connection, perhaps.
And Bloody Jack, what information I have, came out in 2002, the second edition from the University of Alberta, so folks can go look that one up if they'd like. Two more quick ones here, Mr. Cooley, before we have to go. I guess you get asked this all the time, but what would you tell somebody, a budding poet, not Billy Budd the poet, but a budding poet, what do you say to them?
Read a lot and widely, be curious and be patient. One of the hardest things for a beginning writer, I'm sure, and I certainly went through this, is you're hoping to find readership. It's hard to find readers. And it can be kind of dismaying if you're a young writer saying, okay, I've written a book. Now the world's going to read my poetry. Good chance they won't. So part of it is you're in for the long haul if you think of yourself as a poet and as opposed to, say, someone who's written an interesting book once and doesn't write anymore. So staying power, humility. The world is not going to run to admire your work. It may, but it's likely not going to do that, not anytime soon at least. Be focused, be dedicated to what you're doing. If you because you care about it, it matters to you, and you can't control whether it matters to anyone else. You hope it will, but the best you can do is the best you can to yourself.
And that's Dennis Cooley. One more. Are you ever going to retire?
No, I'm working away happily. I'm having a great time. Actually, being retired as a professor was, in one way, a godsend. I had a lot more time and energy to spend on my own writing. It won't be evident to people under an academy, perhaps, but professors work very hard. Yeah. You're swallowed up with a lot of things that can't be, certainly aren't, but probably can't even be evident to anyone else. So retiring released me to a lot more of my own work.
And that's Dennis Cooley. The book out now is Body Works. He has lots more you can look up, all under that name, Dennis Cooley, from a variety of publishers, including Turnstone Press out of Winnipeg. Sir, thank you very much for your time today, and it was a pleasure talking to you.
Yeah, me too. Thank you so much, Dennis.
Thank you for visiting with us today. This is Talking Books and Stuff with Dennis Rimmer. Contact him at dennis@talkingbooks.tk. Thank you, and may all the good news be yours. Oh, and don't forget to check out his book, The Great Canadian Notebook, available across Canada and at amazon.ca.